We just heard the case against that new class of civil service called career policy, formerly called Schedule F. It's the Trump administration's way to make the civil service more accountable. For a more cautious view of why this might work this time around, we turn to a research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Sean Higgins. Mr. Higgins, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And you have written that this could work, but it could also backfire. What's your general view of the efficacy of what's now called career policy types of positions?
Well, the longstanding complaint that you've heard from administrations on both sides is just that there's a permanent entity within the government of career appointees and position people who outlast each administration that comes by. And therefore, they can sort of drag their feet on official policies, confident in the knowledge that they'll still be there when that administration has gone on and been replaced by the next one. And it's been a sore point of both sides and something that they've wanted to sort of get rid of. Anybody who's in a position of authority obviously wants the people under them to jump to it when they want their policies to be enacted. And anytime there's institutional resistance to that, it's always going to engender resentment among the people at the top, and they're going to try and find ways to get around that. This is part of a general trend we've seen in government in the last decade and a half or so, where they've tried to sort of winnow away these type of institutional things that slowed the process down. You see this in the Senate, for example, with the changes in the rules towards getting nominations through the committee. Basically, each time the president has a leadership in the Senate that agrees with them, they try and rejigger the rules to make it easier for them to get their people through and make it harder for the minority to stop that. This is a similar sort of mindset going on. It's just make it so that the people in the administration, in these lower level agencies, have to do everything the administration does at the snap of the finger. And that's basically what we're seeing.
Right. So your thesis then is that this could work for the other side, the Democratic side, if they get back in, and then the same thing would work in reverse. That
it might actually even work a little better for the Democrats because they're probably going to have an easier time finding people to fill these positions within the government. I mean, one of the traditional problems Republicans have always had is finding talented people to work in bureaucracy. People with the talent in industry typically are much more entrepreneurial, and they want to work in business or some other entrepreneurial thing. They don't want to work for the government. Democrats just tend to have more civic-minded people who are more interested in working for the government, and therefore they have an easier time finding these people. So therefore, they're much more likely to find people who are willing to sort of fill these positions when they can. So I think in the long run, it might actually benefit the Democrats a little more than it benefits the Republicans.
So that's why you're saying it could backfire.
Yes. In the longer term. I mean, in the near term, Trump will probably get what he wants. And unfortunately, we live in an era where everybody just sort of thinks about the present and not the future. But I do think down the road, this could actually benefit the Democrats more than the Republicans.
And how much does, in your experience, does the bureaucracy, if you will, or the high levels, the senior executive service, and there's a couple of 100,000 GS 15s and 14s, I think 13, 14, 15 SES is about half the whole entire government. Do they really have to thwart policy, or certainly they can further policy, they do what they're told, but can they really stop policy? Because it's such an obvious thing to say no to something that you have an order to do.
I don't think they do it generally as a sort of malicious thing, but I do think there's a lot of people who are just sort of sticklers for their rules, very sort of parochial in how they cover the way their agencies and departments do things, and they'll resist pressure from the outside. And the civil service rules make it easier for them to do that because they know they'll be around when this administration passes. It's just something they have to put up with for a while. So, it's not like the Trump administration will be able to replace everybody that's put on the Schedule F. I mean, the estimate is something like 50,000 people could potentially be affected. We don't really know yet. But even if that were the case, they probably would only be replacing probably a few hundred people at the most, because it's just literally hard to find that many people. In the previous Trump administration, there's about 4,000 people who, outside of Schedule F, are appointees that the president can put in there and can take out at will. And at any one point, there's about 1,000 of those spaces were still empty. So they had to struggle. They struggled just to fill the spots that they can fill without controversially changing the rules. Changing the rules on top of that and trying to find another 50,000 people, even though they've apparently tried to create like binders full of names and people to do this, it's still very hard to do. I mean, just speaking from personal experience, back when I was still a reporter, I had some friends who did work for the government who were trying to get me to apply for various positions there, saying, because I was in the mood for a career change, and they're like, look, they're just looking for warm bodies. They're struggling to find anybody to fill these spots, and they're now trying to expand the number of people that they can do that to exponentially, and they're just not going to be able to find them to fill it. But they may be able to knock out the one or two people that they decide that are really dragging their heels, and that's the sort of where the tension is coming from.
We're speaking with Sean Higgins. He's a research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So therefore, is career policy, or Schedule F, whatever you want to call it, a good idea or a bad idea? I guess the question really is fundamentally, is the bureaucracy actually not accountable to the public or to an administration?
It's a really tough question because, there are certain cases where, under the existing rules, bureaucracy can be very slow and bloated and difficult to move. Taking the ship of state around, it takes time, and there's a lot of laws that also make this take a while. There's the Administrative Procedures Act, which any rulemaking has to go through all these procedures, and it can take about 2 years just to change a rule. And then an administration is only 4 years, so then it may only be in effect for 2 years. And that's assuming that they got to it when they hit the ground running. So the idea of having more people to aggressively put something through seems on the surface a good idea, but then it depends on whether or not you think the rule changes in particular that they're making. And that's a classic example of, do you like the current administration or not? If you like the current administration, you're going to say, absolutely, I want the people in these agencies to jump to it and put their policies into effect. If you don't, you're going to think the opposite. And so therefore, people's opinions are going to change with this based on what administration is in there. So I think just in terms of whether it's a good idea or not, I think it's a wash. As I said, and as we discussed earlier in this broadcast, I do think that in the longer run, it may benefit the Democrats more than it benefits the Republicans, because they're going to have an easier time replacing people and finding people to fill these spots than Republicans are. So therefore, it may benefit them more. But beyond that, I don't have a strong opinion for it, because it really just sort of, whether or not it's a good idea or not is based primarily on whether or not you think the current administration is good and whether you support their policies or not. It's going to change according to that.
Right. So it may be not inherently evil, but it might be practical or overly practical in the sense that we'll get even wider swings in the comings and goings.
As a free market think tank, I will say that sometimes I do actually think gridlock is a good idea. Sometimes you don't want government to be too active. You want it to be slow. You don't want it to interfere that much. You want it to sort of leave people alone. So there are times where slow-moving bureaucratic government is actually a good thing, because it means it takes time for something, and bad ideas tend to fall by the wayside, and only the good ones tend to bubble to the top because they have broader support.
Sean Higgins is research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll post this interview along with a link to his essay on career policy at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.